everyone. But it's all good. All right, so good afternoon, everyone. And thank you certainly for joining us here for this announcement. I'm pleased to be joined by my honorable colleagues, the Deputy Premier and President of Treasury Board, as well as the Minister of Environment and Climate Change and Minister responsible for Labour, to announce pay equity and pay transparency legislation for Newfoundland and Labrador. This legislation will undergo a second reading in the House of Assembly this afternoon. The Pay Equity and Pay Transparency Act will be meaningful to all workers in the province and will be particularly impactful to women and gender-diverse people and populations who have faced systemic biases and unfair compensation practices. As our government has been working to close the gender wage gap, this legislation is another tool that we can implement to address the gender wage gap and reduce inequities in the workplace. This is certainly a positive step forward for our province as we work towards gender equality. Pay equity legislation will enshrine in law the equitable pay practices that core government has been doing for years and will require that other public sector employers also have fair compensation practices in place. The pay equity provisions in this piece of legislation have been thoroughly analyzed and compared with legislation in other jurisdictions in Canada, such as legislation in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. While the pay equity provisions apply only to the public sector, it is our government's intention to use this legislation through a robust consultation process to determine a path towards pay equity within the private sector. The legislation also includes pay transparency provisions for the public and private sectors. Pay transparency laws require employers to make their pay practices public and is viewed by many as a means of achieving pay equity. The proposed legislation does not outline a specific timeline for implementing the pay transparency provisions for the public and private sector, as consultation with employers and the business community will be critical to inform regulations of the Act, including specific elements of reporting requirements and timelines for implementation. Our government understands that accountability mechanisms are often as equal as important as the legislation that is being implemented. That is why this legislation has specific consequences for those employers who do not implement pay equity or pay transparency elements as required. In addition to regular reporting on pay equity and pay transparency provisions, there are fines that can be levied on an employer as an individual, as well as an employer as a corporate or public body. This legislation is a positive addition to our government's policy package to support women and gender-diverse people, as well as other marginalized populations. This policy package includes using women employment plans and gender equity and diversity plans, implementing $15 a day daycare as of January 2022, and further to decrease to $10 per day in January 2023. Creating a new wage grid for the early childhood educators by January 2023 to acknowledge the equal value and skills in a woman-dominated field, and increasing minimum wage to $15 a day by October 2023. As we look forward, I'm optimistic that this legislation will have a positive impact for the people of our province and will support employers in fostering more inclusive and fair workplaces. As our province continues to build back in a post-pandemic environment, pay equity and pay transparency practices are valuable to job seekers and can help position Newfoundland and Labrador as an attractive place to work. I'd like to now invite my honourable colleagues to speak to the importance of this legislation with their portfolios.
Thank you, Minister Parsons. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us here today. I'm pleased to join my Cabinet colleagues, Minister Parsons and Minister Cody, as we work collectively to move this important legislation forward to the House of Assembly. Achieving pay equity and closing the gender wage gap are important issues to government, employers, and workers here in our province. As Minister Parsons previously stated, Creating a truly equitable society takes action from everyone. And as Minister responsible for Labour, I'm pleased to play a role in the implementation of the pay transparency in Newfoundland and Labrador. Pay transparency is a public disclosure of compensation details by businesses. This new legislation will require pay transparency from both private and public sectors. Once implemented, Newfoundland and Labrador will be the second province in the country, alongside the federal government and Prince Edward Island, to make pay transparency law. Under Part 2 of the Act, in relation to pay transparency specifically, both the public and private sectors will be required to not request past employment pay history from new employees, include pay range and scales for all positions in job postings, not intimidate, dismiss, or penalize an employee or applicant for making inquiries or requesting information related to pay, prepare and submit pay transparency reports to the minister responsible. And I want to be very clear that the provincial government will consult with the businesses prior to the implementation of pay transparency, as this is a framework. We want to work with businesses throughout the process and feel it's important that their voices are heard. Accountability is essential, but also is collaboration. Details on a fulsome pay transparency consultation process will be released in the coming weeks. Pay transparency is just one step in the process to pay equity. It is one mechanism to help level the employment playing field and another step towards helping address the gender wage gap in Newfoundland and Labrador. Thank you, Minister.
Thank you. Minister?
Thank you very much, Minister Davis and Minister Parsons. The advancement of women and gender diverse individuals is a priority for our government, and as President of Treasury Board, I'm very pleased to join my colleagues today as government advances and legislates the requirement of pay equity. This pay equity legislation requires employers in the public sector to establish, maintain, and implement compensation practices that are based on the relative value of the work performed, irrespective of the gender of the employees. This means we will take the practices that guide our job evaluation system and make them law. To ensure our public sector employees are fairly and equitably compensated, we implemented a job evaluation system in 2015. This system covers 85% of core public service employees who work on the front line delivering programs and services to Newfoundlanders and Labradorians. It addresses the 4 standard criteria recognized in all pay equity legislation for the purpose of job evaluation, which are skill, effort, responsibility, and working conditions. Our job evaluation system is just one example of how our government supports women, gender diverse, and marginalized employees in the public service. Over 50% of the core public service, including senior management, directors, and executive, are female. We strive to foster a workplace that is supportive of women, including such policies as the minister has outlined as flexible work arrangements, family responsibility leave, compassionate care leave, to name just a few. I want to thank personally our Premier, Ministers Parsons, Ministers Davis, and the many officials for their leadership in bringing forward this important and meaningful legislation. All of us are responsible for ensuring equity in our society, and this legislation is another step forward. Thank you.
Thank you. So this certainly is a historic moment for our government and for Newfoundland and Labrador, and as we look to implement pay equity and pay transparency legislation. Pay equity legislation for the public sector is a stepping stone, as my colleagues have said, and our government is committed to implementing pay equity legislation within the private sector after the consultation process. So I'd also like to extend a thanks to the media as well. You guys have done your part certainly in keeping this very important topic on the radar by asking your questions, and at this time, I'd like to thank you for joining us and certainly open the floor to your questions.
I know you've had 5 years to consult these various groups on this. Why do you need to do more consultation?
Well, as you can appreciate, today we're making history. Today is a good day. As we know, the conversations back to pay equity have started ultimately back in the 80s. So it is, as we said, we're cleaning up. I guess we're starting in-house first with public sector pay equity, and it's important. We're all stakeholders here in Newfoundland and Labrador, and it's very important to hear and to consult with the experts and the stakeholders, of course, that play a big role, and of course, in the successful economic well-being of Newfoundland and Labrador.
You say you're committed to having legislation for the private sector. Will you put a date on that?
Well, I think we've got to, I'll jump in if you don't mind. I think it's really important that the consultation period happen. I mean, obviously, that's our end goal for pay equity in the private sector as well as the public sector, which we're announcing here today. But it's important that they play a role in it. This is a framework that we've created here based on other jurisdictions, based on the research from our as Minister Cody mentioned, the fantastic staff that we have working in these departments. And we're going to move forward, but the only way to move forward is consult those that are going to make the best insight. We want to remove as much red tape as possible for businesses in the communities that we all represent.
If I may, can I add to this? It's very important that we've laid out now the framework around pay equity, and we're enshrining it in law. And that is what we're going to bring to the business community and to other, not just the business community, all stakeholders, to have further discussions on how we implement further. We've started, as Minister Parsons has said, with the public sector, framing that into law. We're following best practices in other jurisdictions. So now, as we go forward, that framework is also moving forward. And I think that there will be meaningful discussions on how best to implement in outside the public sector into the private sector. So I think the meaningful discussions will be based on this framework.
It's important to get it right and to put the best legislation forward.
It's taken 5 years just to get this for the public sector. You know, will we expect it to take another 5 years for the private sector?
I can say this. It's taken a lot longer than 5 years. Pay equity has been a challenge. I'm a female who's been in both the public and private sectors. Pay equity is something that we wish to enshrine in law, and we have taken the best practices across that we found across the country. We've made and translated that into what's best for Newfoundland and Labrador, and we have now enshrined that in law. And in the public sector, enshrined it in law, and we're moving forward to do so with the private sector. And I think that's meaningful developments. And there are multiple other steps that we have taken. There's no magic step forward here. This is one step of many steps to ensure both the leadership of women and gender diverse individuals is brought to the fore. And as I said in my opening remarks, equity is all of our responsibility. This is another step forward.
Is it not a fair criticism, though? You're talking about your jurisdictional scan across the country. More progressive legislation or legislation that goes further has existed in Ontario and Quebec since the 80s and 90s. Why not, the speed at which the government is going at doesn't seem very fast. Is that a fair thing to say, given that the practices that we're adopting when you're talking about Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, well, those have existed for over a decade there. I mean,
Since the 80s.
Is the government not, right, for longer than a decade, is the government moving quickly enough on this? I mean, you talked about a made in Newfoundland approach, progressive legislation. Is this it?
Well, I will say too, Quebec and Ontario, if I'm not mistaken, they are the only provinces to have private sector pay equity in the private sector, both public and private. But what's important to consider here is the gender wage gap. This is one tool that's going to be used to help close the gender wage gap. And as we look to our neighbours across the country, that gender wage gap is still pretty wide. Too wide, really. So it's important to add the concrete steps that government's doing to make the difference in everyday lives of people, such as daycare, what we're doing, bringing it to $10 a day. I mean, as an MHA, I hear testimonial from constituents that has made a night and day difference in their work, and they're able to go, and whether it's to go to school or to get back in the workforce to get paid a higher paying job. Also, leadership. I mean, the Make Your Mark campaign that I'll turn to the provincial the Department of Provincial and Municipal Affairs, the investments we're making there. With getting women at the table, I think we had a record high of the most women and gender diverse people to actually run for public office at the municipal level this last election. And that's initiatives that we're taking. I mean, they go on. I mean, investments such as Sandpiper Investments, and investing in women in tech and in non-traditional trades. I mean, this is one tool in our toolbox that we see the rest of the provinces have done to some degree, whether it's transparency, pay equity, both public or private. And again, it's important to do those everyday concrete steps that we can be doing, such as the women employment plans as well, which my office works closely with. For example, the women to advance apprentices and working with Trades NL.
But doesn't this do exactly, like, when you were asked about this previously, the answer was that we need more time because we want to make this a system that works. But this is exactly what exists already in the Maritimes. So how do you explain the time that it took to get here?
Well, as you can appreciate, we're not the Maritimes. We are Newfoundland and Labrador.
The approach is the same.
And again, the stakeholder community groups who have done extensive work on this, I'll turn to the St. John's Status of Women, the work that they've done and the reports that they've presented, such as the Provincial Advisory Council that I work with closely. And if you were to ask our stakeholders, all of them across the board, it's very important to them that they have their input. They're the experts in the fields that we rely on to make the best legislation possible. We're all stakeholders here in Newfoundland and Labrador, and it is important to get this right.
If I may add, I'm going to say this. This borrows and looks at, from across jurisdictions, both pay equity and pay transparency. There are two different, there are some jurisdictions that have some that have both, some not proclaimed. This takes both of that. It moves and puts a pay equity officer, it moves and puts the Director of Labor Standards responsible for making sure that, complaints are addressed. This is pretty strong legislation that I think that is valuable when we're talking about pay equity and pay transparency in the province of Newfoundland and Labrador. And yes, it has taken some time to get us to this point, but look at the leadership of getting us here. The Premier said that we would have legislation this fall. We have legislation this fall. This has been challenging across multi levels, but look at the advancements we're making, not just in this legislation, but as the minister just outlined, these are big steps forward. And I can say that I've been, both, as I said, both in the private and public sectors for a number of years, and I can say these are big advancements and improvements, and we need to continue to make more advancements and improvements to ensure to ensure equity overall, and that's on all of us.
I know the pay transparency section, that won't come until the consultations are complete, and there's no date in the legislation for those consultations to be done. Like, I know there were specific dates for some other things in the legislation, such as for core government. Will you commit to enacting the pay transparency section of this by year's end?
Well, I think that would be for us to prejudge how consultations are going to go with the key stakeholders that we have. That would be foolhardy of all of us. I think we're going to have a fulsome plan that's going to be unveiled in the next few weeks, and those stakeholders are going to actively have a role in that and shape how these regulations are going to fit within this legislation. This is, as I said before, this is a framework that we're going to build around, put, as they say, some more meat on the bone on this one, which is an important piece for us and an important role for the business community to play. And I know from our chatting with the business community, they're looking forward to that role, and I'm looking forward to having them at the table to help shape this legislation and the regulations that come with it.
I'm sure both you, the media, and opposition, and the community itself will hold us to account, making sure we do this as quickly as possible.
The pay equity portion comes into effect on the 1st of April in 2023, and that affects core government, if I understand correctly.
That's right.
And we were also told that something like 85% of core government is covered by other legislation already, which ensures that they have pay equity. So how many people will actually possibly be affected by this legislation that comes into effect on the 1st of April 2023?
You are correct. Approximately 85% of core government employees now have a job evaluation system based on those 4 key issues of skills, responsibility, effort, and working conditions, so those 4. The other 15%, so mostly in the management area, the other 15% are under a HAY system, and they are compliant in 3 of those areas. We need to add working conditions and do a review for working conditions, and that is why we're allowing us till April 1st to be compliant, because we have an outside group that the system, the HAY system is designed from, so we have to have a contract with Corn Ferry to allow us to add that forth. And that'll be 100, so by April 1st, 100% of core employees. We have also reached out to then all employees of government. So I'm talking about Memorial University, I'm talking about Hydro. They are in various stages of compliance, and they have to, many of them use the HAY system, for example, and they have to reach out to the owner of the HAY system to add that extra piece of working conditions. Most of them are fairly compliant, but there's some work to be done, and we're allowing them some time to get that work done so that they can be fully compliant as well. But we would expect that would happen fairly quickly. But again, the company that we have to deal with to allow this to happen, we have to engage in a contract.
Is it possible to say, with the 15% you mentioned, how many people that would be, core government people who are covered by all 4 conditions?
Yep, about approximately 10,000, and of that 10,000 of core government employees, approximately, I'm going to say 1,300 employees are under that HAY management system. So again, that's roughly the 15%.
Why haven't you set a deadline for other public bodies like you have for the April 1st?
Very good question, and again, it has to do with contractual obligations that we need to undertake with the company that provides their job evaluation system. So we need to give entities like Hydro, like Memorial University, the opportunity to engage in those contracts, and as quickly as we can engage in those contracts, they will. We are making sure, for example, internal to government, we have a committee that'll be both on there's a director level, there's a division within Treasury Board that is on classification. We're moving that to classification and pay equity, so they'll ensure that moves expeditiously. And of course, the pay equity officer within the public service, again, it'll be in the Public Service Commission, will also receive the reports on transparency, the reports on ensuring that we are pay equity compliant, receiving the reports on the making sure that we have that all the transparency requirement done. So they'll be monitoring this as well. So as expeditiously as we can to ensure compliance with the Act, that'll move through.
Is there a timeline for consultations for Part 2? Yeah.
We do know it's happening, it's a priority for the very near future.
Absolutely. I mean, we've already talked to the key stakeholders from the business side, and obviously they're chomping at the bit to get moving on this as well. I mean, in the next several weeks, we're going to be coming out with a consultation plan, and that'll take what it takes. And that sounds challenging to hear, but we're going to be held account, as the minister said, by many other parties that are involved. Not just political parties, but also the media, the stakeholders, the community. We want to get this done as expeditiously as possible, but we want to make sure it's done with a fulsome consultation with the stakeholders involved. And that's their primary focus from our partnership that's going to be working on this side as well.
So before end of the year, probably you'll have to start this process?
I don't want to commit to, by the end of the year, we'll start? Absolutely. We'll have that process started, yes. I thought you were going to say complete it then. I was prejudging what you were going to say then. I shouldn't be doing that. But that'll be started as soon as we possibly can.
Premier Fury said this would be progressive legislation. I'm curious whether each of you consider this to be progressive.
Well, as we said, I mean, this is historic. This is a positive step forward. It's a step forward. Any step forward is certainly a step forward. And again, we are all very eager and very passionate about this, especially the Premier as well. And again, I mean, this is the most that any administration has ever done in the history of Newfoundland and Labrador. So absolutely, and again, it's important. We're looking forward and we are eager to work with our stakeholders and to collaborate to put forth the best legislation possible.
Do the rest of you consider this to be progressive?
Oh,
you
yes,
go ahead.
no problem, sorry. Yes, absolutely. I mean, there's only 2 other jurisdictions that have moved in this direction, and we will be the second province that will be doing it. So that is progressive in itself. Is it perfect? Absolutely not. But we can't let the pursuit of perfection slow the process at all. So, I mean, that's where we've got to keep moving, and that's why it's so important to work with our stakeholder group and get the best regulations put in place that we can that's going to help move this, not just the fact of the legislation, but also narrow that gap that exists. We want to make sure that that doesn't exist here in this province, and that's a lofty goal by all of us, but that's what we all want to achieve. And I think that's the goal that all of us share.
Is it progressive? I believe it is. We are moving forward with pay equity legislation. We're requiring the public service and putting out a framework for the private sector to have pay equity. We're ensuring transparency. This is taking the best pieces of the legislation that we have found across the country and bringing it to here. But again, it's only one step. It's progressive legislation in that we have not had legislation, and no other government has been able to bring this forward. We have, so that's good progress. We are making sure that it's both, we're looking at pay equity, we're looking at transparency, we're implementing what I'm going to call requirements of same, and moving forward. That's good progress. Is it enough? We need to do more? Of course we do. Of course we do. But some of the things that the minister has outlined are reasons why this is more of a wholesome view, and why we have a standalone department with its own minister to advance this very important requirement of equity.
The pay equity committee that was struck, I think it was 2017, it met a few times and then it went months without meeting, and then it met again, I think it was in March, something like that. How did the work of that committee inform this legislation, if at all?
Well, I want to say work that has been done, I think that was 2017, I think it was inspired by PMR in the House of Assembly. Because I think it's safe to say, and I speak for all of us, that we're all on the same page and we all want to advance equity. But at this time too, I mean, staff, before my time certainly in the department, have been working extensively on research, on consulting, and doing all the work possible to be done. So I certainly want to thank them for the work that they've done on this. And this is a whole of government approach. As you can see, we have 3 ministers here today working on this to bring this forward. So all that work is valued, and again, the consultations going forward to put the best legislation forward for the people of the province.
I'm going to say if this was easy, it would have been done decades ago. It's not easy. There was a lot of different factors that had to be considered. We had to look across jurisdictions. We had to ensure that we had the right processes in place within government to ensure this. And so we've advanced now to a point where, for the first time in Newfoundland's history, we have pay equity legislation that will also require pay transparency. And that's a positive step forward.
I remember, Juanita, if I could, how passionate you are about this, and it was just less than a year ago when we were talking about this. When will we have this? When will we have this? Well, April 1, 2023, in the public sector, we're going to have pay equity.
Of the groups that have been consulted thus far, what sort of a reception have you received? Are they happy with the direction that government is going in?
Well, certainly stakeholders that I meet with regularly in my office, and we work with the St. John Status of Women. I can't thank them enough how valuable they are, as well as the Provincial Advisory Council. That conversation is ongoing. They're very eager to get at this work, and again, everybody recognizes this. It is a first step, and it's a big movement forward that's never been taken before. And I know you've also consulted with your community stakeholders.
Yeah,
as
so
well.
I mean, anytime you make changes to legislation, there's always an angst that goes along with that from the stakeholders that are there. But one thing is for sure, that the stakeholders are viewed as very positively. The fact that they can get to shape the way the regulations are going to fit for them, I think that's an important piece that they're happy with. But I always dislike when people are asked a question about how they feel about this, because the best question is to ask them. They'll tell you exactly what they believe we're going forward with this, and the fact that our conversation has been very positive about the consultation portion of this, and they're excited about getting involved in that. And that's what I can speak to directly from conversations I've had with them.
Which specific organizations will be involved in these consultations that are upcoming?
Well, I guess from my perspective, the consultation plan will be released in the next next number of weeks, and that'll include a variety of stakeholders. I don't want to prejudge who they're going to reach out to us. We're going to reach out to them to make sure they're involved. But there's going to be obviously employers groups. There will be public sector groups for outside of core government. There's a variety of different organisations that are going to be consulted. That Minister Parsons mentioned a couple already. We look forward to hearing from a variety of stakeholders
And of
on
course,
this issue.
equality-seeking organizations
Absolutely.
as well, absolutely, obviously.
Is this only happening now because it came up in the House of Assembly and because there have been stories about this in the media and all that? Can you explain that?
Absolutely. Well, since actually I was first appointed minister, I guess in April 2021, I think that's what it was, the year, this is in my mandate letter. So I remember one of the very first conversations I had with staff when I walked in the door as minister was about pay equity. So this is something I know it's a priority of this premier, it's a priority of this government, and so this has been always, there's conversations daily about pay equity. So since I assumed this role, it's something that we've been focused on as a top priority.
I think in previous scrums, I feel like all three of you might have been critical of other jurisdictions and wanting to improve upon it here in Newfoundland and Labrador once we finally got our legislation. So do you think that we've done a better job of it here in Newfoundland and Labrador than, say, Ontario, for example?
Well, we're going to certainly, what I could say, I mean, we're going to do our best, absolutely. I mean, and again, it goes back to the gender wage gap, and we want to be realistic here. It's one tool in the toolbox, but it makes a difference with leadership. Promotion of having women and gender diverse people around that table. It's the most healthy table to provide, the most input from all perspectives. I mean, society wants to see a government and wants to see leadership tables that reflect them. And so, again, we're going to do the best we can. I mean, of course, we've done jurisdictional scans, and I will note, and as I have previous, you and I have talked about this many times, that unfortunately that gender wage gap still exists across Canada, across the world.
Mr. Parsons, the next time that you go to the polls, or go to voters, you know what I'm saying? Sorry, let me restart my question. The next time there's an election, you have to go door to door, which, will probably be a few years. Do you think that you'll be able to say to your constituents, we got private pay equity done for the private sector? And if you aren't able to say that, will you consider that a failure?
Well, I will tell you, I don't wait for when an election is called to go door to door or to be involved with my community. I represent the district of Harbour Grace, Portagrave, and every moment I can to get out there to be involved in the community I am. Just yesterday I was hosting the annual telethon for the Trinity Conception Placentia Healthcare Foundation. And I'm always gauging feedback from my constituents. I have an open door policy, if you will, at my constituency office, and where people certainly are very approachable to reach out to me at any time. The promise I make is that I'll certainly do everything I can. I'll do everything in my power to do whatever job that is, whether it's a constituency file, whether it's contributing to policy as we are today, but to do that the best we can on behalf of Newfoundland Labradorians, and of course being honest with the information and always our fiscal reality, what we have to work with.
Should the private sector take this as a signal that private sector pay equity legislation is imminent?
Absolutely, this is a signal. I think that's apparent here today, and this is coming. And again, it is a goal, and it's been made very clear to me as the premier in my mandate, and all of us as ministers, is that certainly we are working to implement pay equity in the private sector. It will take next steps.
Do you think we'll be sitting here in a year hearing an announcement about
If I had a
this?
crystal ball, I tell you. But again, I think we're starting to repeat ourselves here now. But the message is we're very committed to this. This is a historic day. I'm very proud to be the minister to bring it in. I'm very thankful and grateful that I have very competent colleagues and dedicated colleagues across government, and a number of them are here in the room as well today. So we're going to put the best legislation forward that we can, and this work will be consistent and it will be ongoing. And I know we're going to be talking to you again in the very near future.
What are the biggest hurdles to achieving pay equity in the private sector?
I think
As opposed to this.
Yeah, I think that it's it's not been done before here in this province, and the consultation piece is a key for them. We don't want to make this bureaucratic and more red tape for businesses. We hear enough about trying to remove the red tape from business aspects of their operations. It's so important that they're at the table helping shape those regulations that are going to be the foundation of how people report, who reports, how big are the firms that report, how often do they report. Those are questions that are going to come and answers that are going to come from that consultation that we're going to be doing, which is a very, very important piece. I can't understate or overstate how important that is.
Folks, we've reached the end of our time allotment. Minister, do you have any final remarks?
Again, I just want to thank you. I know you're all interested in this, and that's, of course, you're inspiring, and you're doing a wonderful job with your journalistic duties. So again, and to certainly reach out anytime that we can ever, help you, provide you with information that you would need. That goes for everyone, of course. So on that note, I think we're
Thank you.
good.
Thank you.
Thank
And
you.
thank you, Minister Parsons, for leading the charge on this. And for the first time in Newfoundland and Labrador's history, we are bringing forward pay equity legislation, pay equity and transparency legislation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.